You're his wife, Constance. This is your duty, Annunziata sneered, adjusting her designer coat to avoid brushing against the medical bed. Arthur is building our family's empire overseas. He can't be tethered to a hospice room. You, however, have nowhere else to be. Constance stared at the heart monitor, wiping a damp cloth across her dying mother-in-law's forehead. She had sacrificed 3 years of her life, her career, and her sanity while her husband played the absent provider. I'll care for her, Constance whispered, but when he returns, everything will change. The Nielsen estate was a sprawling, suffocating monument to a forgotten era, filled with heavy oak furniture and the pervasive, inescapable scent of clinical antiseptic intertwined with decaying lavender. For Constance Simpson, it had become a gilded prison. When she married Arthur Nielsen 5 years ago, she believed she was entering a partnership of equals. Arthur was charismatic, ambitious, and seemingly devoted. But when his parents, Edita Berenza and her ailing husband, fell severely ill within months of each other, the illusion of their perfect marriage began to fracture. Arthur had immediately announced a critical, multi-year overseas expansion of his consulting firm. I have to secure our future, Constance, he had said, kissing her forehead while his bags were already packed by the door. My parents need round-the-clock care. We can't trust strangers. You've always been so good with them. I'll send money. I'll call every day. It's only for a little while. A little while turned into 3 grueling years. Constance's days were a relentless blur of alarms, medication schedules, sponge baths, and the agonizing symphony of failing lungs. She traded her thriving career in architecture for the isolated life of a full-time caregiver. Her hands, once soft and manicured, were raw from constant hand-washing and lifting. Her reflection in the antique mirrors revealed a woman aging a decade in a fraction of the time. Her eyes ringed with profound exhaustion. And then there were the vultures. Arthur's sister, Annunziata Cecilia, and her husband, the insufferably arrogant Gustav Markal, visited only when it suited them, which was usually when they needed to inspect the estate to ensure their future inheritance wasn't depreciating. They lived just 40 minutes away in a lavish downtown penthouse. Yet they treated the Nielsen home like a museum of inconveniences. The drapes are gathering dust. Constance, Gustav remarked one rainy Tuesday, swirling a glass of the estate's finest scotch that he had poured for himself without asking. He was a man who wore his wealth like a weapon, his tailored suits completely out of place in the sterile environment of a makeshift hospice room. If the appraisers come, this will negatively impact the valuation. You really must try harder. I was up 4 times last night because Edita's oxygen machine malfunctioned. Gustav, Constance replied, her voice dangerously thin, trembling with suppressed rage. I haven't slept more than 3 consecutive hours in 6 months. The dust on the drapes is not my priority. Annunziata scoffed, filing her nails with a crystal file. Oh, don't play the martyr, Constance. Arthur is funding this entire operation. He's out there breaking his back with Chris Gay, securing the merger, while you get to live in this beautiful house rent-free. The least you can do is keep it presentable. Constance bit her tongue so hard she tasted copper. The calls with Arthur had grown increasingly sparse. He was always in a different time zone, always rushing to a meeting, his face on the screen tanned, relaxed, and utterly detached from the nightmare she was living. He spoke of his business partner, Chris Gay, like a savior, painting pictures of endless boardroom battles. While Arthur lived a life of high-stakes corporate drama, Constance was drowning in a sea of pill bottles and soiled linens, holding the hands of the people he had left behind. She felt the hollow vows of her marriage echoing in the empty halls of the estate, but a deeper, quieter realization was beginning to take root in her exhausted mind. As the 3rd winter of Arthur's absence approached, his father passed away quietly in the night. The funeral was a hollow affair. Arthur claimed he was trapped in Dubai, finalizing a contract that would collapse if he left the table. Constance stood in the freezing rain, watching the casket lower into the earth, entirely alone save for the superficial, performative weeping of Annunziata for the cameras of the family friends. After her husband's death, Edita Berenza declined rapidly. The fierce, sharp-tongued matriarch, who had once run the family's local real estate empire with an iron fist, was reduced to a fragile shell. Yet, in her final weeks, Edita's mind seemed to clear, piercing through the fog of her illness with a terrifying lucidity. Constance spent her nights sitting by Edita's bedside, reading to her, feeding her ice chips. The bond between the 2 women, once fraught with typical mother-in-law tension, had forged into something profound and forged in the fires of mutual abandonment. One evening, while the wind howled against the grand windows, Edita reached out with a skeletal, trembling hand and gripped Constance's wrist with surprising strength. Her faded blue eyes were wide, urgent, and filled with a sorrow that made Constance's breath catch in her throat. "Constance," Edita rasped, her voice sounding like dry leaves scraping across stone. "My foolish, beautiful girl. You have given me the end of my life, while he steals the prime of yours." "Shh, Edita, save your strength," Constance murmured, adjusting the blankets. "Arthur is just. He's working. For the family." Edita let out a bitter, wet cough that shook her frail frame. "No, no, he is not. The Nielsen men. They are cowards when the shadows fall. He is not working, Constance. I feel it in my bones. I see the way Gustav looks at this house. They think I am a fool. They think because my body is dying, my mind is already dead." Constance froze, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "What are you saying?" "Gustav and Annunziata," Edita wheezed, fighting for air. "They have been emptying the local accounts. I saw the bank statements before my eyes went bad. And Arthur knows. He lets them. They are waiting for me to die, Constance. They are going to cast you out with nothing." Constance felt the room tilt. "No, Edita, Arthur wouldn't do that. He's my husband. He is a ghost," Edita said with terrifying finality. "Reach under the mattress, Constance. The left side, deep." With trembling hands, Constance slid her arm beneath the heavy medical mattress. Her fingers brushed against a thick, leather-bound folder. She pulled it out. It was a secret ledger, along with a locked flash drive. "Call Matteo Cocciarelli," Edita whispered, her eyes fluttering shut as exhaustion overtook her. "Not the firm's lawyer. My private counsel. Do not tell Gustav. Do not tell my son. Prepare yourself, Constance. The wolves are already at the door." That night, Constance didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen island under the harsh, fluorescent light, staring at the leather folder. When she finally booted up her laptop and plugged in the drive using the password Edita had weakly murmured before falling asleep, the weight of the silence in the house shattered. The drive contained years of financial records, hidden assets, and emails that Edita had intercepted. It also contained an email from Chris Gay, the supposed business partner Arthur was tirelessly working with. The email, dated 2 years ago, was a polite rejection of Arthur's business proposal, stating they had never formed a partnership and requesting Arthur stop using his name. Constance stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in her wide, horrified eyes. If Arthur wasn't working with Chris Gay, where had he been for the last 3 years? And whose money was he living on? Edita Berenzer passed away peacefully on a Tuesday morning, holding Constance's hand. It happened just as the cold, grey light of dawn crept through the heavy velvet drapes, casting long shadows across the mahogany floorboards. There were no dramatic last words, no profound final revelations, only a quiet, stuttering exhale that left the massive house feeling entirely empty. The rhythmic hiss of the oxygen concentrator, which had been the soundtrack of Constance's life for 3 years, suddenly sounded deafeningly loud in the absence of Edita's ragged breathing. Constance sat there for a long time in the creeping daylight, feeling the lingering warmth fade from the older woman's frail hand. Constance methodically performed the duties expected of her. She didn't cry. The tears had been bled out of her over 1,000 sleepless nights. She washed Edita's face one final time with a warm cloth, smoothed her silver hair, and pulled the quilt up to her chin. She called the hospice nurse to pronounce the death. She called the coroner, and she watched numbly as the undertakers wheeled the matriarch out the front door, their solemn faces a stark contrast to the greed that was about to descend upon the house. Finally, sitting at the massive dining table surrounded by suffocating silence, she called her husband. When Arthur answered on the 5th ring, there was music playing in the background, a light, rhythmic acoustic guitar beat that sounded suspiciously like a beachside cafe. The faint sound of crashing waves and the distinct clink of glassware echoed through the receiver. "Constance, darling, I'm just stepping into a crucial meeting with the investors," Arthur said smoothly, his voice entirely devoid of the bone-deep exhaustion that was practically crushing Constance's spine. "Can it wait? The connection here is terrible. Your mother is dead, Arthur," Constance said. Her voice was flat, an emotionless void. The music in the background seemed to pause, or perhaps a hand had been hastily clamped over the phone's microphone. When Artur spoke again, the grief in his voice sounded grotesquely rehearsed, like an actor reading lines from a script he hadn't fully bothered to memorize. What? Oh, my God. Constance, I am so sorry. A seagull squawked loudly through the phone. Is that a seagull, Artur? Constance asked, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the antique chandelier above her. We're viewing waterfront properties for the new international branch, he stammered, recovering quickly. Constance, this is devastating. I'll book a flight immediately. I don't know how long it will take. The storm over the Atlantic is delaying everything, but I will do everything in my power to be there for the funeral. He didn't make it. Just like his father's funeral, Artur Nielsen was absent for his mother's. He blamed a sudden ground stop. He blamed the airline. He blamed the phantom investors who supposedly threatened to pull out if he left the country. Annunziata and Gustav arrived at the memorial service draped in ostentatious black designer morning wear that looked more suited for a gala than a graveyard. As the freezing rain battered the black umbrellas of the attendees, Annunziata threw herself onto the polished casket, wailing with a theatricality that visibly disgusted the older family friends. Gustav, meanwhile, treated the solemn reception back at the estate like a networking event. He schmoozed with local politicians and rival developers, handing out embossed business cards near the hors d'oeuvre. When the crowd thinned, he immediately cornered Constance near the wet bar. It is a tragedy, a profound tragedy, Gustav said smoothly, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, though his eyes were darting around the room, taking a mental inventory of the antique artwork and silver. But the world keeps turning, and we must discuss the practicalities soon, Constance. The estate taxes, the property transfer. It's a massive burden. Constance looked at Gustav, really looked at him. She saw the greed sweating out of his pores, the utter lack of respect for the woman whose ashes were now resting in a velvet box on the mantelpiece, and the arrogant assumption that Constance was nothing but a disposable, temporary maid. Annunziata is the direct bloodline heir, naturally, Gustav continued, leaning in too close, smelling of cigars and entitlement. We're bringing in a staging company on Monday. You should start packing your personal belongings this weekend. We plan to put the house on the market by the end of the month, and buyers don't like to see clutter. The will hasn't been read, Gustav, Constance said quietly, sipping her black coffee without breaking eye contact. Oh, sweet Constance, Annunziata chimed in, suddenly appearing beside her husband, her face completely dry and perfectly powdered despite her previous wailing. Mother's will is from 10 years ago. It leaves everything to Artur and me. We've already spoken to the firm's lawyers. Artur has agreed to sell the estate to our development company. He signed the preliminary proxy papers last week before the incident. You really should have planned for your own future instead of just hiding away in this house. They smiled at her, a pair of synchronized, predatory smiles. They thought they had won. They thought she was broken, exhausted, and utterly defeated. They didn't know about the leather folder tucked securely beneath her mattress. They didn't know about Mathieu Cocciarelli. And they certainly didn't know that the suffocating grief Constance had felt just days prior had rapidly mutated into a cold, calculating, and terrifyingly precise desire for absolute destruction. That evening, after kicking the last of the faux mourners out of the estate and locking the heavy oak doors, Constance did not pack a single bag. Instead, she poured herself a glass of Edita's prized scotch, sat in the dark parlor, and picked up her phone. She dialed a number she had found buried in a hidden directory on the locked flash drive. Nicola Olivetti, a gruff voice answered on the first ring. Mr. Olivetti, Constance said, her voice steady, cold, and hard as steel. I need you to find my husband, and I want to know exactly who he has been sleeping with for the last 3 years. Nicola Olivetti was a private investigator who operated in the shadows of the elite, specializing in dismantling the lies of the wealthy. He met Constance in a dimly lit, smoke-stained diner 3 towns over from the Nielsen estate. He was a stark contrast to the polished world. Constance was used to unshaven, wearing a wrinkled trench coat, with eyes that missed nothing. You're paying a premium for a rush job, Mrs. Nielsen, Olivetti said, sliding a thick manila envelope across the sticky table. But you were right to trust your instincts. Your husband isn't in Dubai. He isn't in London. He hasn't been working a single day since he left you. Constance opened the envelope. The glossy photographs spilled out, hitting her like physical blows despite her mental preparation. There was Artur, heavily tanned, laughing on the deck of a sleek yacht. He looked 10 years younger, completely unburdened by the horrors of sickness and death. Beside him, clinging to his arm, was a striking, much younger woman with long blonde hair and designer sunglasses. Her name is Alois Fizarova, Olivetti narrated, watching Constance's face carefully for a break in her composure. An Instagram model of sorts. He bought her a villa in the south of France. That's where he's been living for 3 years. He set up a shell company to funnel money out of his parents' joint accounts, money that Gustav Marchal helped him launder to avoid tax flags. They've drained nearly $4 million, Mrs. Nielsen. He was waiting for the old folks to die so he could inherit his half of the estate, dump you, and marry the girl. Constance stared at a photo of Arthur kissing Alois. Her thumb traced the image of his smiling face. The man she had loved, the man she had destroyed her own life and health for, was a phantom. Every tear she had shed, every sleepless night, every time she had defended him to his dying mother, it was all built on a foundation of profound, sociopathic betrayal. And Gustav? Constance asked, her voice barely a whisper, though her eyes were burning with a terrifying clarity. Gustav and Annunziata have been skimming off the top of the Nielsen real estate holdings for 5 years, Olivetti confirmed, tapping a ledger sheet. Cooking the books. Edita was right. If they audit the company now, Gustav goes to federal prison for a very long time. But they are relying on Arthur taking over the company as the primary heir and burying the evidence. Constance slowly put the photos back into the envelope. The pain of the betrayal had peaked and passed, leaving behind an icy, hyper-focused state of mind. She was no longer a grieving widow or a neglected wife. She was an architect, and she was going to design their ruin. "Thank you, Mr. Olivetti," Constance said, handing him a cashier's check. "Keep monitoring them. I want to know the exact second his plane touches down." Her next stop was the grand, mahogany-lined office of Matteo Cocchiarelli. The older lawyer had been Edita's fiercest confidant, a man whose loyalty to the matriarch superseded any obligation to the firm. "Edita came to me privately a year ago when she first suspected the embezzlement," Matteo explained, pushing his glasses up his nose as he reviewed the evidence Constance had brought. "She amended her will. She legally revoked all previous iterations and enacted an ironclad trust. But she told me to wait, to let them expose their full hand before dropping the hammer." "The hammer is ready to fall, Matthew," Constance said, leaning forward. "Arthur thinks he's inheriting the empire. Gustav thinks he's taking the estate. I want to give them exactly what they deserve. How legally sound is this new will?" Matthew smiled, a sharp, predatory grin that mirrored Constance's own. "My dear, it is bulletproof." Edita subjected herself to 3 independent psychiatric evaluations to prove her soundness of mind the day she signed it. "When they hear this document, their world will turn to ash. We just need the audience." "Oh," Constance murmured, looking out the window toward the darkening sky. "The audience is coming. Arthur just texted me. He's finally coming home." The days leading up to Arthur's return were a masterclass in psychological warfare, executed entirely within Constance's own mind. She scrubbed the estate until it gleamed, not for Gustav's approval, but to set the stage. She dressed in simple, drab clothing, maintaining the illusion of the broken, exhausted caretaker. She wept on command when speaking to Annunziata on the phone, playing the part of the helpless, terrified widow about to be cast out into the street. "Just pack your things, Constance. It will be easier for everyone." Annunziata had cooed over the phone, dripping with false sympathy. "Gustav is bringing the final estate transfer papers for Arthur to sign the moment he arrives. We can give you a small severance, of course, for your services." "Thank you, Annunziata. You're so kind," Constance had replied, her voice trembling perfectly while her eyes remained dead and flat. When the Blacktown car finally pulled up the long gravel driveway of the estate, Constance was waiting on the porch. Arthur stepped out. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, meant to convey mourning, but his deep tan and the relaxed, well-rested lines of his face betrayed his 3-year vacation. He rushed up the steps and pulled Constance into a tight embrace. "My poor, brave Constance," he murmured into her hair, playing the tragic hero. "I am so sorry I couldn't be here. The business, it nearly killed me to be away from you and Mother." Constance smelled the expensive cologne on his skin, a custom scent made only in boutique perfumeries in France. She felt the muscles of his arms, toned from tennis and swimming, not from the stress of boardrooms. She hugged him back, feeling absolutely nothing but the cold steel of her own resolve. "You're home now, Arthur," she whispered against his chest. "That's all that matters." Gustav and Annunziata arrived an hour later, practically vibrating with excitement. Gustav carried a thick leather briefcase, his eyes practically gleaming with the anticipation of wealth. They gathered in the grand parlor, the very room where Edita had spent her final, agonizing months. The air was thick with unspoken tension. "It is a dark day, but we must look to the future," Gustav announced, standing by the fireplace like the lord of the manor. He pulled out a stack of documents. "Arthur, I have the transfer papers for the estate and the corporate proxy. Once you sign these, the transition will be seamless. We can list the house tomorrow and secure the family legacy." Arthur sighed, rubbing his face in a pantomime of grief. "You're right, Gustav. Mother would have wanted us to be practical. Constance, sweetheart, why don't you go make us some tea? This is family business now." Constance didn't move from her chair. She crossed her legs, resting her hands neatly in her lap. "I don't think tea is appropriate right now, Arthur," Constance said, her voice entirely different from the meek, trembling tone she had used for years. It was loud, clear, and commanding. Arthur frowned, looking at her as if she had suddenly grown a second head. "Constance, please, don't make this difficult." "I'm afraid I have to," she replied. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. "Because before you sign anything, Gustav, I believe we need to hear from the actual executor of the estate." Right on cue, the heavy oak doors of the parlor swung open. Matthew Cocciarelli stepped into the room, flanked by two imposing men in dark suits who looked distinctly like private security. Gustav's smug expression faltered. "Matthew, what is the meaning of this?" "The estate lawyers are handling this." "The firm's lawyers are handling the corporate shell," Mathieu corrected, walking to the center of the room and placing a black leather binder on the table. "I am here in my capacity as Edita Berenzzi's personal legal counsel, and I am here to execute her final, legally binding last will and testament." Annunziata let out a shrill laugh. "Don't be ridiculous, Mathieu. We already know the will. It leaves everything to Arthur and me." Matthew looked at Annunziata with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. "That will was revoked 13 months ago. Mrs. Cecilia, you are about to find out exactly what your mother thought of you." The silence in the parlor was so absolute that the ticking of the grandfather clock sounded like gunshots. Arthur's tan seemed to pale slightly as he looked from Mathieu to Constance, a flicker of genuine panic finally breaking through his composed facade. "Constance, what is he talking about?" Arthur demanded, stepping toward her. "What did you do?" "I cared for your mother, Arthur," Constance said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "While you were away. While you were working." Mathieu opened the binder. "I will skip the legal preamble," he announced, his voice booming across the room. "I, Edita Berenzzi, being of sound mind, do hereby revoke all previous wills, having witnessed the profound greed, moral bankruptcy, and criminal negligence of my blood children. I leave the entirety of my estate, including all liquid assets, properties, and controlling shares of Nielsen Real Estate Holdings, to my daughter-in-law, Constance Simpson." Gustav dropped his glass of scotch. It shattered on the hardwood floor, a sharp, violent sound. "That is impossible," he roared, his face turning a mottled purple. "She was out of her mind. The dementia, we will contest it. We will tie this up in court for decades." "You are a gold-digging whore, Constance." Constance didn't flinch. She slowly stood up, reaching into her bag one final time. She pulled out the thick manila envelope Nicola Olivetti had given her and tossed it onto the coffee table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. "Contest it, Gustav," Constance challenged, her eyes blazing with the fury of 1,000 sleepless nights. "Go to court, and when you do, Matthew will submit Exhibit A into the public record." Arthur reached for the envelope with trembling hands. He tore it open, and the glossy photographs of his life in France spilled across the wood. Pictures of him on the yacht, pictures of the villa, pictures of him kissing Alois Fisarova. Annunziata gasped, covering her mouth. Arthur stumbled backward, falling into an armchair, as if he had been physically struck. "Constance, I can explain. It was a moment of weakness. The stress of the business." "What business, Arthur?" Constance snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. "The business with Chris Gay, because I have a signed affidavit from Mr. Gay stating he hasn't spoken to you in 3 years. You haven't worked a single day. You used your parents' slow agonizing deaths as an ATM to fund your fantasies with a woman half your age. She turned her gaze to Gustav, who was visibly sweating, staring at the financial ledgers that had also spilled from the envelope. "And you, Gustav," Constance continued, stalking toward him. The arrogant man actually shrank back. "Edita found the hidden accounts. I have every record of the $4 million you and Artur embezzled and laundered from the company. The FBI has already received an anonymous tip with the encrypted drive. If you contest this will, if you try to take 1 single cent from me, I will ensure you spend the rest of your life in a federal penitentiary." Gustav looked at Annunziata, panic destroying his aristocratic features. The realization of their absolute ruin settled over them like a suffocating blanket. They had built a house of cards on the assumption of Constance's weakness, and she had just set it on fire. You can't do this," Artur stammered, tears streaming down his face, real tears. This time, tears for himself. "I'm your husband. We can fix this. I love you, Constance." Constance looked down at the man she had once vowed to spend her life with. She saw past the handsome face and the expensive clothes, seeing only a hollow, parasitic shell. "You don't know what love is, Artur," Constance said quietly, the anger finally bleeding out of her, leaving only a profound, liberating peace. "Love is changing soiled sheets at 3 in the morning. Love is holding a dying woman's hand when her own son won't answer the phone. I am filing for divorce tomorrow. My lawyers will ensure you get nothing." She turned to the security guards. "Gentlemen, please escort these trespassers off my property." As Artur, Annunziata, and Gustav were physically marched out of the grand doors, their protests and cries echoing into the night, Constance stood by the window. She watched them get into their cars, driven out into the pouring rain, stripped of their wealth, their dignity, and their future. Hard karma had arrived, and it was exacting its toll. Gustav's company would collapse under the weight of the incoming fraud investigation. Artur, cut off from his funds, would soon find that his mistress, Alois, had no interest in a penniless fraud. They were cast out into the cold, exactly as they had planned for her. Constance took a deep breath, smelling the rain through the cracked window. The oppressive weight of the estate felt different now. It was no longer a prison. It was a kingdom she had earned through fire and loyalty. She was finally free. Life has a terrifying but beautiful way of balancing the scales. Constance's story is a stark reminder that true loyalty is proven in the darkest, quietest hours, not in the loudest declarations. Those who build their lives on manipulation, deceit, and the exploitation of others' kindness will eventually find their foundations crumbling beneath them. Hard karma doesn't always act quickly, but it acts with absolute precision. If you found value in this story, remember to cherish those who stand by you in your hardest times, and never underestimate the quiet strength of a dedicated heart. Please, like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that justice prevails, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of dramatic twists, deep emotion, and the undeniable power of karma in real life. Let us know in the comments. What would you have done if you were in Constance's shoes?